Since you guys really enjoyed the Connor Kenway matchup video a couple of months ago, and with the release of Black Flag Resynced, I figured now was the perfect time to make an Edward version. So today we'll be looking at a variety of Assassin's Creed characters and ranking them based on their chances of defeating Edward Kenway. As always, both characters will be in their prime, neither will be holding back, and every fight will be a completely random encounter with their normal standard gear. I'll be using the same tiers as the last video. Characters in minor obstacle won't be too much of a challenge for Edward. Worthy opponents will likely be a little challenging, but Edward should be able to get the job done. Challenging is what it sounds like. Edward will struggle, but in the end he should be alright. 50-50 is either Edward or his opponent could win. If they were to fight multiple times, both of their win ratios should be around 50%, and they'd defeat Edward as for the characters that would win against him. Since we're covering over 15 characters in this video, I won't be able to break down each one in a ton of depth. If you want more in-depth breakdowns, I have Google Docs breaking down multiple characters' feats and accomplishments available for channel members. With that being said, let's get right into it. The first assassin that we're looking at today is AC2 Ezio. Since Assassin's Creed 2 follows Ezio from his birth until he's around 40 years old, we'll be comparing him to Edward when they're roughly the same age. That puts Ezio at around 30, since Edward is about that age by the end of Black Flag. In my opinion, Ezio in AC2 is still learning and nowhere as legendary as he will eventually be. Brotherhood and Revelations have Ezio accomplishing far greater feats, turning him into a one-man army and practically the Templar's boogeyman. In AC2 though, he's more of an above-average assassin, who doesn't really do anything extraordinary until the end of the game. Edward and this version of Ezio are fairly even in most physical stats. They're both pretty strong, fast, and intelligent. I'd give Edward a slight edge in strength, especially considering some of the original Black Flag animations, where he literally wrestles crocodiles. Ezio is probably a bit faster, having kept pace with the fastest thieves across multiple cities. Where Edward clearly has the advantage, however, is combat skill. AC2 Ezio isn't much of a fighter and relies heavily on stealth. Edward also favors stealth, but he's far more experienced in open combat than young Ezio. At the very beginning of the game, Edward managed to defeat Duncan Walpole, and while Duncan was injured, he was still a decent assassin in terms of skill based on the movie novelization. Edward also took down El Tiburon, and thanks to Resynced, this is actually impressive since Edward did physically fight him rather than relying on firearms the entire fight, like he did in the original. He also fought through various forts, defeated the assassins in Havana, and even defended the assassins' hideout towards the end of the game. Overall, I think Edward would win, so Ezio will go in challenging. Next up, we have Edward's own son, Haytham. And no, it's not the 8-year-old Haytham that we saw at the end of Black Flag. This is prime Haytham, so think the prologue of AC3, his appearances in Rogue, and what we read in Forsaken. In my opinion, the Kenways become deadlier with each generation. In terms of character though, it's probably the opposite. Anyways, I believe Haytham would win more often than not. Physically, he can match just about any assassin. And he was also trained by Edward himself, and later trained by the Templars. And not just any Templar order. He was trained by the British Templars. And if you know the lore, you know just how deadly and feared the British Rite was. Haytham also took down tougher opponents than Edward. Edward did defeat an injured Master Assassin, but Haytham defeated two separate assassin mentors, one being Achilles in Assassin's Creed Rogue and the other being Miko in Assassin's Creed Forsaken. And he defeated Miko without any weapons while Miko was fully armed, which makes it even more impressive. He also took down Reginald Birch and Birch's best men. By comparison, Edward took some time to defeat Torres's lone bodyguard, so I think there's a noticeable gap in their overall combat skill. When it comes to ranged combat, they're actually pretty evenly matched, and if the fight turned into a brawl or a fist fight, I'd also give Haytham the edge. He's been shown defeating trained soldiers and even assassin mentors while completely unarmed, whereas Edward's unarmed feats were mostly against drunken sailors and thugs. I believe Haytham does defeat his dad. Following that, we have Jacob Frye from Assassin's Creed Syndicate. Whenever I have to compare Jacob and Evie to other assassins, I honestly feel a little bad for them. Neither of them spent much time fighting actual soldiers. Instead, most of their opponents were gang members. Even the Templars they faced weren't particularly impressive. Compared to the colonial British right, it's honestly crazy how far Steric's order had fallen. Jacob's biggest advantage over Edward, aside from his more formal assassin training, is his hand-to-hand combat. He's probably the best unarmed fighter we played as in the series, and if he somehow got Edward into a straight-up brawl, I'd definitely give Jacob the win. The problem is that's very unlikely to happen. Edward's fighting style and weapon choice make it difficult for anyone to force him into an unarmed fight. Edward is also much smarter in combat, and if Jacob gets overconfident like he usually does, I think Edward would capitalize on that and beat him without too much trouble. Because of that, Jacob is going into the worthy opponent tier, mainly because of how dangerous he is in a fist fight. Next, we have Thomas de Carnellion. Sorry Thomas, I'm probably mispronouncing your name. Thomas is a very legendary assassin, and it's insane how Ubisoft never gave us any more of him. Like, he should have definitely gotten a game, book, or even comic based on the amount of stuff he did. Thomas was a huge part in why the Templar Order basically died for a little while, and without him the king probably wouldn't have been as successful. However, we just don't have enough information on Thomas. The only thing we really saw of him was him losing to the bodyguard at the beginning of Unity, and that's not enough for him to even come close to beating Edward. If we got to play as him, we'd probably be able to judge him a little more accurately, but we didn't, unfortunately. He did take a direct blast from the Sword of Eden, and while yes, the sword was not at its full power, I still think it's pretty impressive. But I can't rank him very high since we didn't see much from him, nor did we get to play as him. He's going in worthy opponent. I can't rank him any higher, unfortunately. Now we have Yasuke from Assassin's Creed Shadows. Yasuke is quite literally a walking tank and a weapon of destruction. This dude has canonically taken on entire armies and forts by himself. This isn't just open world non-canon stuff that you can do in gameplay. He is required to do this in multiple missions, and he doesn't even break a sweat. He's also beaten a master assassin, he's taken on a Templar samurai, and even the Black Cross. If Edward got into a melee fight with Yasuke, Edward is beyond cooked. In fact, most assassins in the series would likely meet their end with a few exceptions. However, Edward does have a decent shot in certain scenarios. He's far faster than Yasuke, a little more intelligent, and has better weapons and gadgets. If he plays his cards right, he can likely even the odds a little. Though we know Yasuke can take sword slashes thanks to his armor and has survived gunshots. If Edward gets lucky, he could maybe defeat him the same way he got Tiburon. But Yasuke can aim dodge bullets and has fought opponents that are fast enough to deflect them, at least in gameplay. So I'm going to say Yasuke has an equal chance of winning against Edward. I know this may upset some people, but after looking through Yasuke's document, I have to put him in 50-50. Next up we have Charles Lee, Edward's grandson's mortal enemy. And if you're interested about Edward versus Connor, I went over that matchup in my previous video. Anyways, I don't think we need to explain this matchup. Edward may go a little easier on Lee compared to Connor, but at the end of the day, Charles Lee is getting destroyed. Lee is all talk, and without Haytham puppy guarding him, he's dead meat. He's going in minor obstacle. The next matchup we have is with Jack the Ripper from Assassin's Creed Syndicate's DLC, and honestly I'd love to see this fight. I think Jack could definitely exploit Edward's trauma with his fear tactics. Imagine Jack mocking Edward's losses and pushing him to lose his cool. We kind of saw this with Maynard in Resynced, but Jack would take it to another level. It would make for a really interesting matchup. That being said, Jack has the same problem as Jacob. He never really fought anyone that impressive. Most of his opponents were police officers and gang members, which doesn't compare to the trained soldiers Edward fought. Jack definitely has his strengths though, and he's a dangerous fighter. Evie couldn't break through his defenses without relying on stealth and weakening him first. However, I don't think Edward would run into the same issue, since Edward is definitely tougher than Evie. Jack excels at ambushing his enemies and manipulating the city from the shadows, but in a straight up fight against someone as skilled as Edward, I don't see him coming out on top. He's going into the worthy opponent tier, probably just above Jacob. Alright, now we have Shay Cormac. I used to be pretty confident that Shay would win this matchup, but I think Resynced made things much closer. Sure, Shay is probably stronger, more experienced, and has more formal training, but Edward is pretty equal with him in most categories. They've both fought assassins, assassinated Templars, and are highly skilled captains. I actually think Edward has the edge in pure combat skill based on the opponents he's defeated. Shay never really beat any impressive assassins in direct combat, as most of the assassins he eliminated were defeated under specific or situational circumstances. I think Edward could replicate most of the things Shay did in some way. That said, Shay does have some important advantages. His equipment is superior, and he's probably the deadlier individual overall thanks to his experience as an assassin hunter. Even if the assassins he hunted weren't the strongest, the skills and tactics he developed during those hunts could be very effective against someone like Edward, who doesn't really have in-depth assassin training. Because of that, I'm putting Shay in the 50-50 tier. Next up, we have Arno Dorian from Assassin's Creed Unity. Arno has always been a bit of a tricky assassin to rank in these videos. He is one of the more stealth-oriented assassins, although he can definitely handle himself in a fight when necessary. He might even be the more skilled duelist compared to Edward, and he excels in 1v1 encounters. But I still think Edward is the more effective overall combatant. We saw a relatively inexperienced Edward cut through assassins with ease, whereas Arno never really accomplished anything on that level. Sure, Arno defeated several skilled swordsmen throughout Unity, but I think Edward could have done the same without much trouble. The way Edward fought El Tiburon, along with the speed and aggression he displayed during that fight, is probably more than Arno could realistically deal with, especially if you factor in the reinforcements throughout that encounter. Arno is likely smarter and better educated, so he might be able to come up with a strategy. But I don't think he has the physical strength or the overall experience to stand up to Edward in a straight fight. If he had the time to prepare or carefully plan the encounter, I'd give him a much better chance. Unfortunately, that's not how these matchups work. Arno is going in the worthy opponent tier. Moving on, we have Aya, also known as Amunet from Assassin's Creed Origins. In my opinion, Aya is a very underrated assassin and an excellent fighter. She's also highly skilled in stealth, has faced some incredibly dangerous opponents, and was trained in the Medjay traditions alongside Bayek. She is probably one of the smarter assassins we've seen in the series and is a pretty good leader. Without her, I doubt the Hidden Ones would have survived past the Egyptian Brotherhood. At the end of Origins, Aya defeated Septimios while he was wielding a Piece of Eden, although it's never made completely clear which artifact he was using. Septimios was one of the Order's greatest warriors and even killed the Medjay Hepzibah within seconds without much effort. I think he's kind of like the El Tiburon for that Templar order, just a little more dangerous. Aya is also incredibly impressive in the comics. In one scene, the Romans tie her hands behind her back and throw her into an arena filled with 3 hippos underwater. She somehow manages to kill one of the hippos using a single sharp stone and nearly defeats another before the assassins arrive to rescue her. She's honestly far more capable than most people give her credit for. That being said, I still think Edward has the advantage in several key areas. He's definitely stronger, faster, and far more durable. Edward has survived explosions, gunshots, stab wounds, and countless other injuries. Aya has endured her fair share of punishment, but nothing quite compares to what Edward has survived. He was also tortured for months by the Templars while imprisoned, something the games never show, but the novel does. Like Aya, Edward is also an intelligent leader, as we see through the way he commands his crew, officers, and fleet. With Edward's superior physical abilities, above average combat skill, and his much larger arsenal, I'm placing Aya in challenging, though I might move her around based on where the other characters rank. Next is Basim from Assassin's Creed Mirage. I did cover Connor vs Valhalla Basim in the last video, but this is a completely different version of the character. In my opinion, Mirage Basim is more of a typical assassin. He investigates targets, carries out assassinations, and that's mostly what we see him do throughout the entire game. He's very stealthy and intelligent, but he doesn't do anything that crazy. It's only at the very end that he begins to unlock his true potential, leading to the far deadlier Basim we see in Valhalla and the novels. Throughout Mirage, Basim helps support a few rebellions, but aside from that, we don't see him involved in many combat encounters, especially if you exclude the ending. To his credit, he does defeat Roshan, but he only manages to do so after deliberately weakening her before the fight actually begins. If Mirage had featured more combat-focused missions that showcased Basim against stronger opponents, I'd probably rank him higher. As it stands though, he's going into the worthy opponent tier. Let's move on to Daniel Cross, probably the greatest assassin hunter we've seen in the series. He's featured most prominently in Assassin's Creed 3, but most of his story comes from the comics released around that time. Daniel was essentially programmed by the Templars to infiltrate the Assassin Brotherhood and assassinate the Mentor entirely on his own. Afterward, he underwent extensive Templar training and became one of the key figures behind the global assassin purge. If you've ever wondered why the modern day assassins are so weak, Daniel is a big reason why. For years, he was considered the Templars' top operative, completing countless missions and often tracking entire assassin teams by himself. If Daniel were specifically hunting Edward, I think Daniel would eventually bring him down, since Daniel is very smart and resourceful. In a completely random encounter though, I think it's much more debatable. We know Daniel is an excellent fighter, he has extensive assassin and Templar training, and he's been shown taking on some of Abstergo's best agents. In fact, it took an entire squad of Abstergo operatives to finally subdue him. That being said, Daniel is extremely unstable. If he were to temporarily lose control during the fight, Edward could exploit that weakness the same way Desmond did in AC3. Assuming that doesn't happen though, it would still be a very close fight. Daniel also possesses the bleeding effect of Nikolai Orlov. While Nikolai isn't among the strongest fighters in the series, he's more than capable of holding his own. Even so, I think Edward would beat Nikolai fairly comfortably, so I'm placing Daniel in the challenging tier. In my opinion, Daniel's strengths come from ambushing and tracking assassin teams rather than straight up fights. Next up is Altaïr, and yeah, I think we all know how this one is going to end. Black Flag Resynced definitely made Edward a better fighter in my eyes, but compared to Altaïr, Edward just isn't as impressive. We've already gone over some of the toughest opponents Edward defeated, but Altaïr fought some of the strongest enemies in the entire series. He defeated his own mentor while Al-Mualim wielded the Apple of Eden, fought his way through an entire army, and if you include the side games and novels, his accomplishments become even more ridiculous. Altaïr has far more training, is easily more intelligent than Edward, and has significantly more experience. Even in his 60s, he had no trouble cutting down assassins. While it's true that Abbas's assassins were generally weaker than the assassins under Altaïr, it's still an impressive feat. He even managed to disarm multiple assassins in his 80s while they were actively trying to kill him. If you dropped Altaïr into one of the forts from Black Flag, I genuinely think that he has a very high chance of clearing the entire place on his own. Because of that, I think Altaïr beats Edward. Moving on, we have Shao Jun, Ezio's last apprentice. I also think Shao Jun is pretty underrated. Not enough people talk about her. She appears in Assassin's Creed Chronicles China, and her entire assassin style revolves around stealth. If anyone could get the jump on Edward, I'd say Shao definitely has a good chance of doing it. She also received excellent training, having been mentored by the late Ezio, one of the greatest assassins in history. Edward, on the other hand, learned most of his assassin skills on the fly, with guidance from Mary Reed or the other Assassin Bureau leaders, rather than through formal Brotherhood training. That being said, Shao isn't much of a fighter, at least not compared to Edward. She's definitely faster, but I don't see her winning in a straight up fight. Her arsenal probably won't do her any favors either, since Edward has the superior weapons overall. Maybe her footblade could catch Edward off guard, but aside from that, I don't think she'd pose a huge challenge. She's going into the worthy opponent tier. Next up, we have Edward's good friend and right-hand man, Adéwalé. And just to clarify, this is Adéwalé from Freedom Cry, not the version from Rogue or the main Black Flag story. Off topic, but I'm honestly disappointed that Freedom Cry isn't getting a remake. Ubisoft, it's one of the most loved Assassin's Creed DLCs. It stars a fantastic character, and if you're planning to remake Rogue, you should absolutely remake Freedom Cry, since Adéwalé plays a major role in both. Anyways, when the original Black Flag released, Ubisoft stated that Edward and Adéwalé were equals in terms of skill, and I don't see any reason why that wouldn't still apply after Resynced, since they're the same characters. By the time of Freedom Cry, Adéwalé is a highly experienced assassin, who has already completed his training under Atabai. He's also clearly stronger than Edward physically, and during the DLC's final mission, he practically wipes out the Governor's army of guards by himself. Adéwalé is also incredibly durable. The dude escaped slavery as a teenager, killed his overseer on his own, own, and in Freedom Cry he even survived being struck by a rogue wave. The same rogue waves powerful enough to destroy entire ships. On top of that, he fought alongside Edward during many of his greatest accomplishments, including the battles against the legendary ships and while defending the assassin hideout at the end of Black Flag. I don't usually compare gameplay, but in this case I think it's worth mentioning. If you compare Edward's gameplay in the original Black Flag to Adéwalé's in Freedom Cry, it's pretty obvious who's portrayed as the more brutal and deadly fighter. It's practically as noticeable as comparing Naoe and Yasuke. Overall, I think Adéwalé beats Edward. He's accomplished many of these same feats while having significantly more assassin training, more experience, and superior physical abilities in almost every category. And lastly, we have Bion from Assassin's Creed Origins Desert Oath. He's essentially the man responsible for hunting down the Magi before the events of Origins. I actually have an entire video covering his story if you're interested, along with a YouTube short that gives a quick overview of who he is. The thing about Bion is that he's very similar to Shay and Daniel Cross. He's exceptionally good at tracking down his targets and setting up ambushes. At the same time, he's also an extremely capable fighter. I'd actually rank him above both Daniel and Shay in terms of pure combat skill. He defeated Bayek and Bayek's father in a 2-on-1 fight, and Bayek was nearly 30 years old at the time, meaning he was likely close to his physical prime. If Bion was hunting Edward or even fought him during the beginning or middle of Black Flag, I'd say Bion would have a very good chance of winning. However, by the end of the game, Edward is simply too versatile in my opinion. Bion is probably the better melee fighter, but when you factor in all the dangerous situations Edward has survived, along with his arsenal of firearms and gadgets, I think it evens the odds. If Bion managed to close the distance and force Edward into a pure sword fight, I'd probably give him the advantage. But considering Edward's speed and mobility, I don't think that's likely to happen. I'm going to place Bion in the challenging tier. I think that's the best spot for him. Anyways, that was all the matchups for this video. Obviously, we couldn't cover every character in one video, so let me know what characters you'd like to see in part 2. This was my opinion, and it was a more casual matchup video rather than a full in-depth analysis for all of these characters. However, I tried to be unbiased, and if we look and examine every feat, it's likely the final tier list might be switched around a little, but I think the general ranking would still hold up. If you disagree or want to add to any of the matchups or outcomes, let me know why you think so in the comments. I enjoyed making this, and I think I'll be making either a part 2 or have a video centered on another assassin like Ezio. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to drop a like and subscribe since I make many videos like this. With that being said, thanks for watching, and as usual, have a great rest of your day.